My son celebrated his promotion with the entire family except me, and I still remember the way that sentence felt like it didn't belong in a normal world, like something had shifted in the air long before I even stepped into that house in Charlotte, North Carolina. "Where's his mother?" someone asked softly at the door, and I heard Brittany answer before I could even reach the hallway. "Oh, she's fine. She just gets tired early." Then Jason's voice, my son's voice, the voice I once used to hear say, "Mom, come sit next to me," now said something different. "Mom, you don't have to stay long, okay?" And I stood there holding a small gift bag I had brought, feeling like it suddenly weighed more than I could carry. Brittany smiled at me in a way that didn't reach her eyes and said, "Don't forget the leftovers, Margaret." A few people laughed softly, not cruelly at first, just unsure. The way people laugh when they don't want to notice something is wrong. Jason didn't laugh, but he didn't correct her either. That was the moment something inside me went quiet. Not broken, just quiet. "Okay," I said, because it was the only word that fit between us anymore. And I watched my son turn away from me like I was part of the background of his life, not the beginning of it. If this story speaks to your heart, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and share where you are watching from, your city, your country, and what time it is right now where you are. Because sometimes stories like this feel less lonely when we know we are not hearing them alone. My name is Margaret Collins. I am 72 years old, and what I am telling you is not just about one night in a house filled with laughter that didn't include me. It is about the moment I realized I had already been erased long before anyone asked me to leave, and that night was only when I finally saw it clearly. Stay with me until the end of this story, because what you think you understand in the beginning is not what it becomes by the end. And now let me take you back to where everything started. The house was warm that evening in a way that made the cold outside feel like another life entirely, the kind of warmth that comes from success, from promotion, from people who believe they have finally arrived somewhere important. Jason had called me earlier that week, his voice quick, distracted, but still familiar enough to make me smile when I heard it. "Mom, it's just a small dinner," he said. "Brittany's handling most of it, you know how she is." I said, "Of course, sweetheart, I wouldn't miss it." And I meant it, because mothers don't measure distance the same way sons do. When I arrived, Brittany opened the door just slightly before stepping aside, like she was letting in a guest, not family. "You made it," she said, glancing at my coat. "Traffic wasn't bad?" "No," I replied. Jason appeared behind her, tie slightly loose, phone still in his hand, and for a second I thought he might actually smile the way he used to. "Hey, Mom," he said, and I waited for the rest of it, the hug, the pause, the recognition, but it didn't come. Instead, he added, "You can sit over there for now. We're still setting up the main table." I followed his gesture and saw where, over there, meant near the kitchen entrance, but away from the long dining table where his colleagues and friends were already gathering. I remember looking at him and saying quietly, "Is something wrong with my seat?" He hesitated just a second too long before answering. "It's just easier this way tonight." Brittany leaned in slightly, lowering her voice just enough to make it feel personal. "We're trying to keep things organized, Margaret, you understand." I nodded, because I always understood things that were never explained clearly to me. As guests arrived, I listened to fragments of conversations, his promotion, his future, how impressive it all was, how proud everyone should be. Someone raised a glass and said, "To Jason Miller, who built this from the ground up." I clapped when everyone else clapped, even though something inside me noticed how no one looked in my direction when they said family. Later, when I stood to move closer to the table, Brittany gently touched my arm and said, "Let's not crowd the space, okay? You can enjoy from here." There was no anger in her voice, only certainty, and that was somehow worse. Jason walked past me once during the evening, and I said softly, "I'm proud of you." He paused, just briefly, and replied, "Thanks, Mom. We'll talk later." But later never came. It always never came anymore. I noticed the way he avoided looking at me directly when Brittany was nearby, as if love had become something he needed permission to show. And when dinner was served, I saw my plate placed slightly apart, not forgotten, just separated. Brittany leaned toward me one last time that night and said, "You should take some food home. There will be leftovers." And then she smiled like she had done something kind. Jason didn't hear it, or pretended not to. I looked at him across the room, surrounded by people celebrating him, and I realized I had become someone he could step around without noticing the space I used to fill. I finished my glass of water slowly, set it down carefully, and said, "Okay." Again, but this time it didn't sound like agreement. It sounded like decision. I drove home alone through the quiet streets of Charlotte, past lights that blurred slightly through the windshield. And I remember thinking not about anger, but about clarity, the kind that arrives too late to argue with. When I got inside my house, I didn't turn on many lights. I sat at the kitchen table where Jason used to do homework years ago, and I placed my hands flat on the wood like I needed to feel something real. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I simply stood up, walked upstairs, and began packing a small bag, not because I was running away, but because something in me had already left before my body decided to follow. On the counter, I wrote a letter, short, careful, without emotion that could be argued with. Then I placed it where I knew it would be found. The house felt different after that, as if it had already started forgetting me. And just before I turned off the last light, I noticed something unusual on my phone, a notification I didn't expect, a message marked urgent from a name I hadn't heard in years, connected to documents I never thought Jason would ever need to see. And that was the moment I realized this night at the celebration was not the end of the story. It was only the part where I finally stopped pretending I was still in it. After I left that house, the silence did not feel like emptiness. It felt like memory finally catching up to me, like every corner of my life was slowly replaying itself without asking permission. And that night I sat at my kitchen table in Charlotte, North Carolina, staring at the faint reflection of my hands on the wood, and I began to understand something I had avoided for years. This was not the first time I had been made to feel like I did not belong in my own son's life. It had just never been this clear before. I remember Jason when he was 10 years old, standing in a Little League uniform that was slightly too big for him, smiling at me from the dugout as if I was the only person in the world who mattered. "Mom, did you see that hit?" He shouted after every small success, running toward me even when the other parents were already calling their children away. I used to think that kind of connection could not change. I used to believe it was permanent. But people do not wake up one day and become strangers. They become strangers slowly, in pieces so small you only notice them when you try to remember the shape of what was once whole. It started, I think, after his father passed away. Jason was 19 then, still in community college in Raleigh, still calling me almost every night just to ask how I was doing. And I would tell him I was fine even when I was not, because mothers are trained to become background noise in their children's lives. "Mom, are you eating properly?" he would ask. "I am eating more than I should." I would answer, trying to sound lighter than I felt. Those calls became less frequent when he transferred to a university in Atlanta, and I told myself that was normal, that growing up meant distance, that love just changed shape. I remember one winter when I drove 6 hours just to bring him soup when he had the flu, standing outside his apartment door in the cold Georgia air. He opened it, surprised, almost embarrassed. "Mom, you did not have to come," he said, coughing slightly. "I wanted to," I replied, stepping inside. Brittany was not in his life yet then, or maybe she was, just not in a way that mattered to me yet. I did not notice the shift until years later, after they married, after the photos on his social media began to look like a life I was no longer standing inside of. The first time I felt it clearly was during a Sunday call. I remember because I was folding laundry, listening to him talk about work, about deadlines, about a meeting that had gone well. I said, "I miss you, Jason." There was a pause, just a fraction too long, and then he said, "I know, Mom, things have just been busy." Brittany's voice came faintly in the background, asking him something I could not hear, and I waited, expecting him to come back to the conversation, but he did not. That was the first time I felt like I was speaking into a room that no longer had a place for my voice. After that, things changed in small administrative ways that never looked like rejection on their own. Calls became shorter. Visits were scheduled like appointments. Decisions were already made before I was informed. Once, I asked him if I could come by for Thanksgiving early, help with cooking like I used to, and he hesitated before answering. "We already have it planned out. Mom, Brittany has it under control." Brittany always had things under control. That phrase followed me like a quiet door closing. I remember one afternoon standing in my own kitchen, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold without me noticing, when Jason called to tell me about a promotion he was being considered for. His voice was excited again, the way it used to be when he was younger. If it goes through, it is going to change everything, he said. I smiled into the phone and told him, "You deserve it, Jason. You always work harder than anyone I know." Then Brittany's voice came in again, closer this time. "Just tell her after it is official," she said softly, not knowing I could hear. Jason did not respond. Not yes, not no, just a small silence that told me more than words ever could. That was when I started noticing the pattern, not one moment of cruelty, but many moments of absence. The absence of correction when I was dismissed. The absence of invitation when plans were made. The absence of recognition when I entered rooms where I once belonged without question. And still, I told myself it was temporary, that families adjust, that love stretches even when it hurts. I did not see that stretching can also become thinning. That night after the dinner, when I sat alone in my house and saw the message on my phone marked urgent, I did not open it immediately. I remember placing it face down on the table as if distance could delay meaning. Instead, I walked through my house slowly, noticing how quiet it had become over the years. Jason had grown away from it. His childhood photo still hung near the hallway, slightly faded at the edges. I touched the frame and said quietly, "When did you stop coming home?" Not expecting an answer. The answer was already everywhere. It was in the missed Sundays. It was in the shorter visits. It was in the way he said my name less often than he used to. Later that night, I finally opened the message, and what I saw was not just information, it was confirmation that something beneath all of this had been moving for longer than I realized. Something tied to names, documents, and decisions I had never been included in. And in that moment, I understood that what happened at the celebration was not an ending or even an accident. It was simply the first time I was forced to see the shape of a truth that had been growing quietly for years without me in it. The message I saw that night did not leave my mind, not because of what it said directly, but because of what it suggested was already moving without my permission, like doors quietly opening in places I had locked years ago. And by morning, the air inside my house in Charlotte felt different. Heavier in a way that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with expectation, because I knew before my phone even rang that Jason would call, and when it finally did, his voice was not the voice of my son, it was the voice of someone trying to manage a situation he did not fully understand. "Mom, we need to talk," he said, no greeting, no warmth, just urgency sitting on top of exhaustion, and I answered slowly, "Good morning, Jason." As if time still worked the way it used to between us, there was a pause. Then Brittany's voice came through the line, sharper, more controlled. "Margaret, we saw something last night, and we need clarification." And I closed my eyes for a moment because the word clarification is never about clarity. It is about control. I said nothing immediately, and Jason continued, "There are documents connected to accounts we did not know you were still managing." And I felt something inside me shift, not fear, not surprise, but recognition. Because that was the moment I realized they were no longer only distant, they were reaching. "What accounts?" I asked calmly, and Brittany answered before Jason could. "All of them that are linked to Jason's family trust, and possibly the estate structure from your late husband." Her tone carried something careful, like she had rehearsed being right, and I stood by the kitchen counter, watching morning light slide across the wood surface, and I said quietly, "You should not be accessing those without speaking to the managing attorney." And Jason exhaled like I had complicated something simple. "Mom, we are not trying to fight you. We just need access so we can understand what is going on." And there it was, not a request, but a rewrite of reality where I was the obstacle, not the foundation, Brittany added. "Honestly, it is unusual that you are still listed on anything at your age. We just want to make sure everything is properly updated." And I remember the word updated landing differently than they intended, because what she meant was replaced, removed, corrected into something more convenient. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table where so many years of ordinary life had passed unnoticed, and I said, "Jason, when was the last time you actually looked at the original trust documents?" And he hesitated, just slightly. "That is not important right now," he replied. But I could hear in his voice that it was exactly what mattered most. Brittany then said, "We spoke with the bank yesterday. They said your name is still the primary authorization on one of the accounts tied to the college fund structure. That does not make sense anymore." And I almost smiled, not because it was funny, but because I remembered every year I had quietly signed those structures into place when Jason was younger, Every meeting in offices where men in suits spoke as if financial responsibility was something separate from family life. Jason continued, "Mom, if something is wrong, we just need you to be transparent with us." And that word transparent carried the weight of accusation dressed as concern. I stood up and walked toward the window, looking out at a street where everything looked normal enough to believe nothing important was happening anywhere. And I said, "I have been transparent for your entire life, Jason." And Brittany cut in immediately. "This is not about emotions. This is about legal structure." And that was when the shift happened, subtle but irreversible, because she had stepped fully into something she did not understand she was already inside. I turned back to the table and said softly, "If you are involving the bank and attorneys, then you are already past the point of misunderstanding." Jason's voice tightened. "Mom, do not make this difficult. We are trying to help you." And I looked at the phone as if he could see my face through it. "Help me with what exactly?" I asked, and there was silence. Not empty silence, but loaded silence, the kind that tells you people are reading things they did not expect to find. Then Brittany said something quieter, almost to herself, but loud enough for me to hear. "This account structure cannot exist like this unless she is still." And she stopped, and I felt it then, the first true shift in their tone, because something had clicked on their side of the conversation that had not yet fully formed into words. Jason asked, "Unless she is still what?" And Brittany did not answer immediately, and in that pause I knew the secret had just been touched, not revealed, not understood, but touched, like a hand brushing against something buried that was never meant to be uncovered. And then Jason said my name again, but differently this time, slower. "Mom, what exactly did you do with these accounts?" And I answered in a voice that no longer needed to defend itself, "Nothing you were supposed to inherit without understanding where it came from." And the line went silent again, longer this time, heavier. And then a new voice entered the call, unfamiliar but formal, calm, precise. "Mrs. Collins, this is David Harrington from Harrington and Miles Legal. I believe we need to clarify your current designation on the estate trust instruments." And in that moment, I understood the story had moved beyond my son, beyond his wife, beyond even their assumptions, because someone else had now entered the space they thought they controlled. And I looked down at the kitchen table where my hands rested steady, and I said quietly, "Then perhaps it is time you all read what has actually been in place for the last 20 years. And I heard Jason breathe in sharply on the other end, because for the first time, they were not leading the conversation anymore. And whatever they thought they were about to uncover, they had only just stepped into something they had already been standing inside their entire lives without knowing it. The moment the attorney introduced himself on the call, something in the air inside my kitchen changed again, not louder, not sharper, but heavier, like the room itself had decided to stop pretending it was ordinary. And I remember standing still with my hand resting on the edge of the counter, while Jason's breathing came through the speaker uneven and uncertain, and Brittany's voice no longer carried confidence, only calculation, as if she was trying to rebuild control out of fragments she did not yet understand. And then the attorney said something that made the silence tighten even further. "Mrs. Collins, before we proceed any further, I need to confirm one additional identity verification on your file." And I answered calmly, "You already know who I am." And there was a pause before he responded, "That is exactly the issue." And in that same instant I heard a second voice enter the call, older, slower, carrying the weight of someone who did not need to raise his tone to be heard. "David, put me on speaker," the voice said, and there was a brief shuffle, a sound of paper, then a new clarity filled the line. "Mrs. Collins, this is Robert Hayes." And I froze, not because the name was unfamiliar, but because it was one I had not heard spoken aloud in nearly 20 years, and Jason immediately reacted. "Who is that?" he asked, and Brittany answered too quickly. "I do not know." But I already knew, because some voices do not belong to the present, they belong to a past that never fully closed, and Robert Hayes continued. "Margaret Collins, Charlotte, North Carolina, correct." And I said quietly, "Yes." And there was a long exhale on the other end of the line, the kind of breath someone takes when a memory finally confirms itself. And he said, "I did not think I would hear your name again in a civilian context." And Jason interrupted, "Can someone explain what is going on?" And Robert answered without hesitation, "Your mother was one of the senior financial compliance coordinators for Defense Logistics Contracting Oversight in the Southeast region. She handled trust and procurement verification structures tied to federal-level contracts. And I closed my eyes for a moment because I knew what would come next. Not because I had ever hidden it, but because I had simply never spoken about it at home. And Brittany finally broke in, her voice less steady now. That does not make sense. She is just. And she stopped herself, as if the word she was about to use no longer felt safe to complete, and Robert cut through the silence again. Just what? He asked, and there was no hostility in his voice, only precision. Because if you are reviewing account authorization structures tied to the Collins estate trust, then you are not dealing with a retired widow who lost her way through paperwork. You are dealing with the person who built half the authorization framework you are now trying to interpret. And I heard Jason shift on the call, a sound like someone stepping backward without moving their feet, and he said softly, "Mom." And for the first time that morning, his voice carried something unguarded, something closer to confusion than control. And I replied, "I never told you everything I did because I thought it did not matter once I came home." And Robert spoke again, slower now, as if confirming something internally. "I remember your name from the Fort Belvoir audit review panel years ago," he said. "You corrected an entire trust allocation system that prevented a multimillion-dollar misrouting issue in federal subcontracting funds." And there was a silence after that, not empty, but compressed, like the weight of understanding had finally found its place in the room. And Jason said, "That is not possible," but his voice did not sound certain anymore. And Robert responded gently, "It is not only possible, it is documented." And then the attorney, David Harrington, cleared his throat. "Jason, Brittany, I think you both need to understand something very clearly." And I could hear papers shifting again, the sound of someone finally choosing to stop guessing and start reading. "Your mother is listed as a primary fiduciary signer on the Collins estate trust structure, not in a ceremonial capacity, but in a controlling authorization role that predates your father's final amendment." And Brittany whispered, "Controlling." Like the word itself did not belong in the same sentence as me. And I finally turned away from the counter and looked out the window at the quiet street, at the normalcy of cars passing and neighbors walking dogs, and I said softly, "I did not take anything from you." And Jason answered immediately, almost instinctively, "Then why does it look like you have control over everything?" And Robert answered before I could, his tone now carrying something heavier than explanation, "Because she was never removed." And that was the moment I felt the shift happen on their side. Not anger, not denial, but recognition forming too late to be gentle. And Jason said my name again, slower this time, like he was testing whether it still belonged to the same person. And I replied, "I never needed your permission to remain where I already was." And there was a long silence, the kind that makes distance feel physical. And then Robert spoke one final time, his voice quieter now, almost resigned. "Jason Miller, I need you to understand something as someone who has reviewed hundreds of estate conflicts," he said. "You did not uncover a problem with your mother." And he paused, and when he continued, the words carried the weight of finality. "You just discovered you have been negotiating with the wrong assumption for your entire adult life." And I heard Jason inhale sharply. Brittany did not speak at all. And in that silence I realized something had already begun to break, not between us yet, but between what they believed and what was real. And Robert added, almost under his breath, "Oh no." And Jason asked, "What?" And Robert answered slowly, "You did not just challenge her access." And another pause followed, heavier than the last. "You touched the structure she built." And I closed my eyes again, because I knew what came after that realization, not from fear, but from memory, because people always think they are opening a door when in reality they are only confirming they were already standing inside the room with someone they never understood. And Jason finally said quietly, "Mom, what did you build?" And I looked out at the morning light again, steady now, no longer uncertain, and I answered, "Something you were never supposed to notice until it mattered." And the line went completely silent, and I understood then that the truth had already entered their lives, and it was no longer asking for permission to stay. The silence after Robert Hayes spoke did not feel like an ending. It felt like a space that had suddenly become too large for any of us to stand comfortably inside, and I remained by the window in my house in Charlotte, North Carolina, watching the morning move as if nothing important had just fractured behind it, while on the other end of the line I could hear Jason breathing in a way I had not heard since he was a child, trying not to cry in front of me. And then Brittany finally spoke again, but her voice had lost its earlier certainty. "If what you are saying is accurate," she said carefully. Then there must be public records. And Robert replied without hesitation, there are. And that single sentence shifted something again. Because public records are where truth becomes inconveniently accessible. And Jason said quietly, Mom, are you still there? And I answered, I am here, although part of me already felt slightly removed, as if I was listening to a version of my life being explained to me rather than living inside it. And then the attorney, David Harrington, cleared his throat and said, Jason, Brittany, I am going to recommend something very simple. And I could hear paper turning again, the sound of someone finally choosing structure over confusion. We are going to pause speculation and move to verification, he continued. Because what I am looking at in your mother's file is not informal history. It is classified level contractor clearance documentation from multiple federal audit cycles, and Brittany immediately responded. That cannot be correct, but her tone no longer carried the confidence of certainty, only the habit of denial, and Jason said, Mom, what kind of clearance documentation? And there was a pause on my end, not because I did not know how to answer, but because I had spent so many years not needing to define it out loud, and I finally said, the kind that only exists when your work intersects with government contracts that cannot afford mistakes. And I heard Jason exhale slowly, and then Robert added, Margaret Collins was not simply a financial coordinator, and he paused as if choosing whether or not to open a door fully. She was a senior compliance auditor assigned to defense logistics restructuring during federal subcontract consolidation periods in the late 1990s and early 2000s, and I closed my eyes because hearing it spoken aloud always made it sound like someone else's life, not mine. And Jason said, Why did you never tell me that? And I answered softly, because you never asked about anything that did not fit into the version of me you needed. And that line did not create anger, only silence again, heavier now, more informed, and Brittany finally said, If that is true, then why would you be involved in our family trust at all? And Robert responded immediately, because the trust was structured using instruments she helped design during her contracting tenure, and there was a sound on the call like someone stepping back from a desk, and Jason said, That does not make sense, but it no longer sounded like rejection, it sounded like someone losing ground. And I walked slowly back to the kitchen table and sat down again because the conversation had become something that required stillness, and then Robert said something that changed the temperature of the entire exchange. Jason, your mother's name appears in the original fiduciary authorization schema as a continuity safeguard, and I heard Brittany repeat under her breath, continuity safeguard, as if the phrase itself was foreign, and Robert continued, which means she was not placed into the structure later. She was built into it from the beginning, and I watched my own reflection in the dark glass of the window and thought about how strange it was that people can live next to something their entire life without ever seeing its shape. And Jason said, Mom, are you saying you control the trust? And I answered, I am saying I never stopped being part of how it functions. And there was a long pause. And then Brittany said something quieter, more controlled again. But different now. Jason, we need to understand the full scope of this before we make assumptions. And Jason responded, I do not even know what assumptions I am supposed to make anymore. And that was the first time I heard real instability in his voice. Not anger, not accusation, but disorientation, and Robert intervened again. There is something else, he said, and I could hear papers shifting, the sound of a file being opened. Margaret, do you still maintain access credentials for the Secondary Compliance Archive? And I replied, yes, without hesitation, and there was a brief silence before he said, Then you still have visibility into the audit trail of every financial adjustment made on the Collins estate structure since its inception. And Jason immediately said, Audit trail, and Robert confirmed, every modification, every signature validation, every attempted override. And I could feel the conversation shifting again, because now it was no longer about identity. It was about exposure, and Brittany said sharply, who attempted an override, and Robert did not answer immediately. And that pause was louder than anything before it, and when he finally spoke, his tone had changed slightly. There have been 3 flagged attempts in the last 18 months to restructure beneficiary allocation percentages without proper dual authorization, and I listened carefully, because I already knew where this was going before he finished, and Jason said slowly, Who authorized them? And Robert replied, That is what we are trying to determine. And then he added something that made the room on my side of the call feel suddenly smaller. But your mother's signature block prevented all three from executing, and there was complete silence after that, not even breathing for a moment. And then Jason said my name again. But this time it was not confusion. It was something closer to realization trying to form itself properly, and I answered gently. I did not prevent anything, Jason. I simply remained where the system required me to remain. And Brittany spoke again, but her voice had changed entirely now. So you were saying if she were not there, those changes would have gone through? And Robert answered, yes. And that single word landed differently than all the others, because it implied consequences they had not yet fully calculated. And I could hear Jason moving slightly, as if sitting down or standing up without knowing which he needed to do. And he said quietly, Mom, what exactly happens if your signature is removed? And I looked at the kitchen table again, at the quietness of a life that had always looked simple from the outside, and I said, then everything built around it has to be revalidated. And Robert added, including ownership continuity, and Brittany immediately asked, ownership of what? And this time even Robert hesitated, just long enough for meaning to gather weight. And then he said, everything that has been flowing through that trust structure for the last 2 decades. And I heard Jason breathe out again, slower now, and I realized in that moment that they were no longer looking at me as a mother who had left, or a woman who had been misunderstood. They were beginning to see something else entirely forming behind all of it, something that had been there long before the dinner, long before the phone call, long before they ever thought to question it. And Jason finally said in a voice that no longer carried authority, only uncertainty, Mom, who are you really? And I did not answer immediately, because for the first time, that question was no longer simple, and on the other end of the line, I could hear the beginning of understanding arriving too late to remain comfortable. The silence after Jason asked who I really was did not break immediately. It stretched, not empty, but full of people waiting for something to collapse or confirm itself, and I could hear the faint shifting of voices on the call, Robert Hayes still present, the attorney still listening, Brittany breathing in short controlled intervals like she was trying to hold a structure together with effort alone, and Jason, my son, waiting for an answer that would either save or end the version of me he thought he knew. And I finally spoke, not faster, not slower, just steady. You are asking the wrong question, I said, and there was a pause before I continued. The question is not who I am. And I leaned back slightly in my chair, looking at the quiet kitchen that had witnessed every version of my ordinary life. The question is what you have been relying on without ever asking where it came from. And I heard Brittany immediately respond, her voice sharper again but no longer confident. That sounds like avoidance. And Jason added, Mom, we are not trying to fight you. We are just trying to understand. And I nodded even though they could not see it, and said, then understand this first. And I took a breath, not because I needed courage, but because I needed clarity. Every structure you are discussing, every account, every authorization layer you are trying to untangle, was never designed to operate without accountability. And Robert interrupted gently. That is correct, and I continued. And accountability does not disappear because someone decides they are done listening. And there was a pause, a longer one this time, and then Jason said, Mom, are you saying we have been using something we were not supposed to control? And I replied, I am saying you have been benefiting from a system you never questioned because it always worked. And Brittany let out a small laugh, not amused, but stressed. This is ridiculous, Jason. She is talking in circles. And I turned my head slightly toward the phone as if she could see me, and said calmly, No, Brittany, I am not. And that was the first time I used her name directly in a way that removed all softness from the conversation, and the line went quiet again. And then Robert spoke. Mrs. Collins, I think it may be time to clarify something for all parties. And I answered, Go ahead. And I could hear him adjust papers again. Jason, Brittany, your mother is not a passive beneficiary in this structure, he said carefully. She is a controlling compliance authority with veto capability over any financial reallocation attempt, and I heard Jason repeat softly, veto capability, as if the words did not belong in the same sentence as Mom, and Brittany immediately responded, That cannot still be active. And Robert replied, It is active until formally dissolved through federal-level compliance reauthorization. And there was a silence after that which felt different, because silence now carried consequences. And Jason said, "Mom, why would you have something like that?" And I answered quietly, "Because at one point in my life, people trusted me with systems that could not afford emotional decision-making." And Brittany cut in again, "So you are saying you can block anything we try to do?" And I replied, "I am saying I do not block anything." And I paused just long enough for it to land correctly. "The system does." And I could hear Jason exhale again, longer this time. And then he said, "We never knew any of this." And I responded, "That is because it was never meant to be part of your daily life." And Robert added, "Jason, I need you to understand the legal reality here." And Jason answered quickly, "I understand enough." But his voice said otherwise. And then something changed in the background of the call. I heard movement, a chair shifting, Brittany speaking more quickly now. "Jason, we need to fix this immediately. We need to contact the bank again. There must be a way to override." And Robert interrupted her firmly. "There is no override without her direct authorization." And for the first time I heard panic enter her tone, not loud, but fractured. "That is not possible. People do not just hold control like that indefinitely." And I said softly, "They do when responsibility is tied to continuity rather than ownership." And Jason asked, "What does that even mean?" And I replied, "It means I was never placed in your life as something temporary." And there was a pause again. And then Robert said something quieter, almost reflective. "Jason, I have seen structures like this only a few times in my career." And Jason immediately asked, "And what happens in those cases?" And Robert did not answer immediately. And that silence felt heavier than all the previous ones combined. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried caution. "It means decisions you think are personal are actually procedural." And Brittany interrupted, "This is insane, Jason. She is controlling everything from some outdated system." And I finally stood up from the chair and walked slowly toward the window again, not to escape the conversation, but to ground it in something real. And I said, "Brittany, listen carefully." And my voice remained steady, not elevated, not emotional, just factual. "Nothing I am involved in is outdated. It is documented, verified, and still legally active because no one ever initiated a proper dissolution." And there was a pause. And then Jason said quietly, "Mom, are you telling me we cannot access anything without you?" And I answered, "I am telling you access was never meant to be independent of accountability." And Brittany finally broke. "So, what do you want from us?" she said. And for the first time there was no control in her tone, only pressure. And I turned slightly back toward the table and said, "I do not want anything from you." And that sentence created a silence so complete it felt like distance expanding. And Jason said my name again, softer now, "Mom." And I replied, "You asked what happens if my signature is removed." And I paused, because this was the part they had not yet understood. "Nothing happens immediately," I said, "but everything that has been operating under assumption begins to correct itself." And Robert added quietly, "And correction is not always fast." And Jason said, "So what do we do now?" And I looked out at the street again, at the ordinary world continuing without awareness of what had just shifted inside one house. And I said simply, "Now you wait for the system to respond." And Brittany whispered, "That sounds like a threat." And I answered without hesitation, "No, it is a process." And there was silence again, but this time it was different, because on the other end of that silence, I could hear it. The first real sound of understanding beginning to turn into something irreversible. And Jason finally said, almost to himself, "We were never in control of this." And I replied quietly, "No, you were just living inside it." And the line went silent, not because the conversation ended, but because for the first time, they realized it had never belonged to them to begin with. The silence that followed my last words did not feel stable. It felt like something holding its breath too long, waiting to see which direction it would break. And I stood by the window in my Charlotte home while the phone line stayed open, no one speaking, no one willing to be the first to admit they no longer understood the ground beneath them. And then Brittany spoke again, but her voice was no longer sharp with control. It was thin, carefully assembled. "Jason, we need to call someone else," she said. And Jason answered immediately, "Who else?" And there was a pause before she replied, "Another attorney, someone who can challenge this properly." And Robert Hayes cut in calmly, "You can certainly attempt that, but it will not change the underlying structure." And I could hear movement on the line again, papers shifting, a chair scraping slightly. The sound of people no longer aligned in the same direction, and Jason said, "Mom, can we just stop for a second?" And his voice was no longer defensive. It was fractured, and I answered softly, "We have not started anything yet, Jason." And that sentence seemed to land heavier than anything before it, because it reframed everything. And then Brittany said something unexpected. "This is not her fault alone." And I could hear Jason turn toward her. "What are you talking about?" And she hesitated, then said, "If this structure is real, then someone built it that way on purpose." And that was the first crack, not toward me, but between them. And I stayed quiet, because this was no longer about me explaining. It was about them interpreting reality without agreement. And Robert spoke again. "There is something else you need to understand before you escalate this." And Jason immediately asked, "What else?" And Robert replied, "Any attempt to bypass authorization will trigger internal compliance review flags across all connected accounts." And Brittany snapped, "So she can just shut everything down." And Robert corrected her gently, "Not shut down, but pause verification until reconciliation is complete." And Jason said slowly, "Reconciliation," like the word did not belong in his world. And I finally stepped away from the window and sat back down because I could feel the conversation changing shape again, not toward resolution, but toward fragmentation. And then something happened that I did not expect. Jason lowered his voice and said, "Brittany, what did you do yesterday when you spoke to the bank?" And there was a pause, and Brittany answered quickly, "I was trying to help us understand what was happening." And Jason replied, "You said her name directly to them." And Brittany immediately defended herself, because I thought she was hiding something. And Jason said, "Hiding what?" And for the first time I heard irritation directed at her instead of me. And she responded sharply, "How was I supposed to know she had this level of authority?" And Jason raised his voice slightly. "You told me she was just managing old paperwork." And Brittany fired back, "Because that is what you told me." And in that moment the structure that had been holding their certainty together began to tilt. And I remained silent, because this was no longer my argument, it was theirs. And Robert said quietly, "I recommend you both stop making assumptions about intent and focus on documented fact." But it was too late for tone to stabilize anything. And Jason said, "So now what? We just accept that my mother has been controlling everything this whole time." And I answered calmly, "You are still thinking in terms of control." And there was a pause, and I continued, "What you are calling control is actually responsibility that has never been removed from its original placement." And Brittany laughed once, short and disbelieving. "That sounds like semantics," she said. And I replied, "Semantics is what lawyers call reality when people do not like the words." And there was silence again. And then Robert said something that shifted everything once more. "Jason, I need to inform you that I have just received confirmation from the institutional archive that your mother's authorization profile is not only active, it is primary." And Jason said immediately, "Primary for what?" And Robert answered, "For override validation across all secondary trustees." And there was a long pause after that. And then Brittany said in a lower voice, "Jason, that means every decision we made since the promotion dinner could be." And she stopped herself, and Jason finished it quietly. "Could be invalid." And I heard him stand up or move away from something, the sound of uncertainty turning physical, and then something unexpected happened. Voices rose again, not at me, but at each other. Brittany said, "You told me this was under control?" And Jason replied, "I thought it was." And she said, "You never verified anything." And he answered, "Neither did you." And I listened without intervening as the argument that had once been directed outward turned inward. Because when people discover they do not understand the system they are inside, they always begin by blaming each other before they blame the structure. And Robert tried once more. "I suggest we slow down." But Jason interrupted him. "No, I want answers now." And Brittany added, "Then start by explaining why she was never removed." And Robert replied, "Because removal would require her consent, and that was the final shift, because it meant nothing they had assumed about separation, exclusion, or replacement had ever been legally simple." And Jason said my name again. But this time there was something different in it. Not confusion, not anger, but recognition forming too late. And I finally spoke again, quietly, "You are not watching something happen to you." And I paused. "You are watching something you never understood how to see." And there was silence on the line. And for the first time since this began, no one argued, no one corrected, no one interrupted. And I realized then that I had not needed to act, because the system they thought they were fighting had already begun correcting the relationships inside it on its own, and all I had done was remain where I had always been. The conversation did not end with a final sentence. It faded instead, like a room slowly losing tension when no one knows who is supposed to speak next. And I remained seated at my kitchen table in Charlotte, North Carolina, listening to the last traces of uncertainty settle across the line until even silence itself felt like a decision. And for the first time in days, I did not feel pulled forward by questions. I felt something else, something quieter, something almost unfamiliar, stillness that did not demand explanation. And Jason finally spoke, but his voice was no longer searching for control. It was searching for understanding. "Mom," he said softly, "I do not know what I am supposed to do with this." And I closed my eyes for a moment before answering. "You are not supposed to do anything right now." And there was a pause, and then Brittany, much quieter than before, said, "We did not mean for this to become all of this." And I listened carefully, because intention and outcome rarely arrive together in life, and I said calmly, "Most things do not begin with intention, they begin with assumptions." And there was silence again, not sharp this time, not fractured, just empty enough for truth to breathe inside it. And Robert Hayes finally spoke, his tone no longer procedural, but reflective. "Mrs. Collins, I have seen many cases like this in my career, but very few where the structure was still intact after this long." And I replied gently, "Because most people do not realize they are still standing inside something they stopped noticing years ago." And Jason exhaled slowly and said, "So what happens now?" And I looked out through the window again, at the ordinary street, at the trees moving slightly in the morning wind, and I realized something important, not about documents or authority, but about distance. And I said, "Now nothing changes immediately." And I paused, because not everything that is real needs to be acted on to exist. And there was a long silence after that. And then I heard Jason say, "Mom, can I come see you?" And for the first time since the beginning of this, I did not answer quickly, because the question was no longer about logistics, it was about presence. And I finally said, "Not today." And there was no anger in my voice, only clarity. And I continued, "Right now, you need to sit with what you have just learned without trying to fix it." And Brittany added quietly, "Where are you going to be?" And I turned slightly from the window and said, "Somewhere quiet." And Jason asked, "Are you leaving Charlotte?" And I answered, "I am leaving what is unnecessary." And I could hear that sentence land differently in each of them, because it was not rejection, it was separation. And then something unexpected happened. Jason did not argue. He simply said, "I do not want to lose you." And I closed my eyes again, because that sentence belonged to a younger version of him, and I replied softly, "You are not losing me, Jason. You are seeing me without assumptions for the first time." And there was silence again, longer this time, and then Robert spoke, "Mrs. Collins, if I may." And I said, "Go ahead." And he continued, "Whatever you decide next regarding your role in this structure, it will not erase your history within it." And I nodded slightly even though no one could see me, and said, "I am not trying to erase anything." And I paused. "I am trying to stop carrying what does not need to be carried anymore." And there was a shift on the call, subtle but real, like everyone finally understood that this was no longer about uncovering power. It was about releasing pressure. And Jason said quietly, "You sound different." And I answered, "I feel different." And for a moment I thought about the years that led here, the quiet mornings, the missed calls that became normal, the slow fading of recognition inside a family that never officially broke but stopped fully connecting. And I said, "There is something you learn when you stop waiting to be seen the way you used to be seen." And I paused. "You learn that peace is not something people give you. It is something you stop interrupting yourself to maintain." And Brittany did not respond immediately. And when she did, her voice had softened completely. "We should have asked more questions," she said. And I replied, "Yes, but you did not know you needed to." And that was the first honest sentence between us that did not carry defense or accusation. And then Jason asked again, "Will you ever come back to the house?" And I thought about the house in Charlotte, about the dinner table, about the evening that started all of this. And I said, "I will come back when I am not being pulled into it." And there was a pause. And then I added, "But that may take time." And Jason accepted that without argument and said, "Okay." And it was the first time that word did not feel like dismissal or surrender, just acceptance. And after a moment, Robert quietly said, "Then I think this conversation has reached its appropriate point of pause." And no one disagreed, and the line began to settle. And before it ended, Jason said one last thing. "Mom?" And I answered, "Yes." And he said, "I am sorry for what I did not see." And I held that sentence for a moment, not as forgiveness, not as resolution, but as recognition, and I replied, "I know." And then the call ended, and I remained at the table for a long time without moving. Not because I was waiting for anything else, but because for the first time in years, there was nothing left demanding that I become smaller in order to fit inside someone else's understanding. And later that day, I packed a small bag, not with urgency, but with intention, and I drove north out of Charlotte toward a quiet place I had kept for myself for years, a small lake house outside Asheville, where the air felt slower and the mornings did not require explanation. And when I arrived, I did not unpack everything, only what I needed for now. And I sat by the water as the sun moved across it in quiet lines, and I thought about family not as something that had been lost or won, but as something that sometimes needed distance before it could become real again. And I realized that peace was not a conclusion, it was a direction. And for the first time in a long time, I was no longer moving away from anything. I was simply moving towards stillness that belonged only to me. The lake house outside Asheville, North Carolina, became quieter than anything I had ever known. Not because silence was new to me, but because this silence did not demand explanation. It only existed, steady and patient, like water that has learned how to hold the sky without trying to change it. And in the days after everything collapsed and reformed around that single truth, I stopped checking my phone every hour. I stopped waiting for conversations to continue, and I began to understand something I had never allowed myself to understand before, that peace does not arrive when people finally understand you. It arrives when you stop needing them to. Jason called twice in the first week, and I answered once, not because I was avoiding him, but because I needed time for his voice to stop carrying the weight of panic. And when I finally did speak to him, his tone was different, not defensive anymore, not strategic, just tired in a way that sounded honest. "Mom," he said quietly, "I keep replaying everything." And I stood by the window looking out at the lake and replied, "Replaying will not change what is already known." And there was a pause before he said, "I did not see you." And I answered gently, "You saw what you were taught to see." And I could hear him breathe on the other end like he was trying to accept that truth without turning it into blame. Brittany did not call me directly, but I heard through Jason later that she had gone very quiet, not angry, not argumentative, just distant from a version of life that no longer responded to her certainty. And I understood something important in that absence, that not every collapse is loud. Some simply stop supporting the weight they were never meant to carry. Robert Hayes sent a final message through the attorney confirming that the trust structure had stabilized into its original configuration, that nothing had been removed or added, only clarified. And that word, clarified, felt like the closest thing to resolution the system could offer without emotion interfering, and I realized then that no one had lost anything they were entitled to keep. They had only lost the illusion that access and ownership were the same thing. Jason came to see me once, not at the house where everything had happened, but at the lake house, and when I opened the door, I did not see the same man who had stood in that dining room surrounded by celebration. I saw someone smaller in presence but more honest in expression, and he said, "I do not know how to fix what I did not understand I was breaking." And I stepped aside and said, "Come in," because forgiveness is not always a return. Sometimes it is simply permission to sit without pretending. We did not speak about documents that day. We spoke about memory, about childhood mornings, about things that had once been simple before they were interpreted by time. And for the first time in a long time, he listened without trying to correct the past. Brittany did not come with him, and I did not ask her to. Because some distances are not punishment, they are clarity. And over time, I began to notice the changes that never arrive as announcements. Jason started calling without urgency, just checking in, not to resolve anything, but to remain connected without pressure. And Brittany began building something else for herself, something separate from the structure she once believed defined her security, and I did not interfere with either path. Because peace does not require participation in every story that once included you. Months passed, and the lake changed with the seasons, and I began volunteering quietly at a small local community center in Asheville, helping older women organize financial documents and understand estate planning, not because I was teaching, but because I understood what it feels like to stand inside systems you were never taught to question. One afternoon, Jason visited again and we sat outside near the water, and he said, "I used to think success meant everyone agreeing I was doing well," and I replied, "That is because you were measuring yourself through other people's reactions," and he nodded slowly and said, "I do not want to live like that anymore." And I told him, "Then do not." And it was not advice, it was permission, and for the first time in a long time, he did not look for approval in my face when he made a decision about his own life. He simply accepted it. Brittany eventually reached out indirectly, not with demands or explanations, but with distance that had softened into reflection, and I understood then that life does not always restore relationships to what they were. Sometimes it rebuilds them into something that requires boundaries instead of expectations. And I learned to accept that as its own form of honesty. One evening, as the sun lowered over the lake and the water turned the color of quiet gold, I found an old envelope in a drawer, slightly worn at the edges. The letter I had written the night everything changed. I had not thrown it away. Because even endings deserve acknowledgement, and I placed it gently on the table, not as a reminder of pain, but as evidence that I had once chosen to leave a version of myself that no longer needed to be small. Jason arrived that same evening unexpectedly, standing near the dock as the light softened behind him, and we did not speak immediately. We simply stood in the kind of silence that no longer felt like distance, and he said, "You seem lighter." And I answered, "I am not lighter. I am just no longer carrying what was never mine." And in that moment, I understood that healing does not erase history. It simply removes the obligation to live inside it. As night settled over the lake, I held a small ceramic cup in my hands, warm against the cool air, and I realized it was the simplest objects that often carried the deepest meaning, not documents, not titles, not authority, but the ordinary things that remain when everything else has been understood: the cup, the water, the quiet, and Jason, sitting a few feet away, finally at ease with the fact that love does not always look like closeness. Sometimes it looks like respect at the right distance. And before the night ended, I looked out at the reflection of the sky on the lake and understood something I had spent a lifetime learning too late: that people do not truly change when they are forced to see the truth. They change when they are finally allowed to stop defending against it. And that was when I realized I was no longer waiting for my life to make sense to anyone else, because it already made sense to me. And that was enough. And as the water stayed still beneath the fading light, I whispered quietly to no one and everyone at once that sometimes the most profound kind of love is not being understood, but being allowed to simply exist without explanation. And I want to thank you for being here, for listening, for holding space for this story, and for remembering that even in silence, we are never as alone as we think we are. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of someone, or even of yourself, then take a moment to reflect. And if you feel moved, share where you are listening from and what time it is in your world right now. Because stories like this travel further when they are not carried alone. And if you believe in stories that heal rather than harm, that reveal rather than judge, then I invite you to continue with me into the next ones waiting in this collection. Because every story here is another door into understanding what it means to let go and still remain whole. And in the end, what stays with us is not what was taken, but what we finally stop allowing to define us. Thank you for listening to this story.